A week after the Argentine Grand Prix, a bomb exploded at the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building in Oklahoma City. The bomb, consisting of over 2,000 kilos of fertilizer, diesel fuel and other substances, was packed into a truck parked in front of the building and had the equivalent effect of 2,300 kilograms of TNT, the blast registering 3 on the Richter scale. The federal building partly collapsed, while hundreds of other buildings in a 4-block radius had windows broken. The bomber was stopped within 90 minutes for driving without a license plate, and evidence in the car was found linking him to the bombing. Timothy McVeigh and his co-conspirator Terry Nichols, who turned himself in a couple of days later, had been former US Army soldiers who had become angry at what they saw as US government overreach, both in terms of its handling of sieges such as Ruby Ridge and Waco, but also the federal assault weapons ban that had come into force the previous year. They timed the bombing to coincide with the second anniversary of the end of the Waco siege, and initially tried to minimise non-government casualties with their choice of target, but the truck was parked immediately outside the federal building's daycare centre, and 20 children were among the 167 killed in what remains the deadliest domestic terrorist attack in US history. McVeigh would later proclaim himself unrepentant, saying that women and children had been killed at Waco after all. And a few days before the San Marino Grand Prix, Ginger Rogers died at the age of 83 at her home in Colorado. Born Virginia Catherine McMath in 1911, Rogers trained as a dancer and made a name on Broadway before being cast in musical films like 42nd Street and Gold Diggers of 1933, her first 2 roles. She quickly formed a famous partnership with Fred Astaire and made 9 musical films with him at RKO between 1933 and 39, but also branched out into more dramatic roles, starring in 1937's Stage Door opposite Katharine Hepburn, and won the Best Actress Oscar for the title role in 1940's Kitty Foyle, as well as playing the title role in 1942's Roxy Hart, which would later be adapted as the musical Chicago. As is so often the case with women in show business, as she hit middle age, the screen roles dried up, though she moved back to Broadway again, playing the title role in 1965's edition of Hello, Dolly. Perhaps the most famous quip about her today can be dated to a 1982 Frank and Ernest newspaper cartoon. Ginger Rogers did everything Fred Astaire did, but backwards and in high heels. In Paris, the FIA Court of Appeal met on April the 13th to consider the appeals of David Coulthard and Michael Schumacher against their disqualification from the Brazilian Grand Prix. After much discussion of fuel formulas and manufacturing processes, the decision of the jury was that the fuel was within regulation and didn't provide the drivers with any competitive advantage, so Schumacher and Coulthard were reinstated in first and second places. But the correct procedures hadn't been followed by the teams, so Benetton and Williams would not receive their 10 and 6 points respectively for the race. That meant in turn that Mika Salo and Aguri Suzuki were bounced back out of the points again, and that therefore the Tyrrell and Ligier teams also lost their points despite Benetton and Williams' punishment, which made the collision between the pair in Buenos Aires even more significant. The compromise, as is often the case with compromises, didn't really please anyone, not least Elf, who were threatening a civil lawsuit over the estimated 5 billion francs of commercial damage over the affair. A meeting of FOFAP, the oil company's talking shop, was convened to discuss the situation with representatives from Elf, Total, Agip, Mobil, BP, Sasol, and Shell, who weren't an F1 supplier this year but still had the chair of the organisation. But as usual, the companies were split. The Anglophones, Shell, BP, Mobil and Sasol, were focused on commercial interest and didn't want to rock the boat by getting into a conflict with the FIA, while the Latins, Elf, Total and Agip, were focused on research and wanted to ensure that they would have the freedom to innovate and not be bound by ever stricter FIA rules. Nobody budged, and the meeting broke up without really achieving anything. For their part, the FIA replaced press officer Martin Whitaker, who'd announced the disqualifications at Interlagos, with Alistair Watkins, a former Red Beret paratrooper, but perhaps more relevantly, the son of Dr. Sid Watkins. Guy Ligier made a return to the paddock for the first time since 1992, and everyone was happy to see him, but unfortunately for him he was there because the team that bore his name had also inherited Benetton's status as controversy magnates. First, Giancarlo Minardi had decided to sue both Ligier and Mugen through the Italian courts over the loss of the Mugen engine deal. So Guy Ligier and team administrator Bruno Michel headed down to the Minardi motorhome to see if they could work something out, only to be turned away. No parallel talks. And Ferrari had also been kicking up an official fuss about how similar the JS41 was to the B195, calling it a full-size photocopy, while the French press had also been up in arms about the anglicisation of the team, now headed by Tom Walkinshaw, with Frank Durney and Tony Dow senior roles among others. Hence the cheeky Fabrique en France graphics added to the car's rear wings. Guy Ligier was there to put a beret on things, so to speak, while Flavio Briatore commissioned Charlie Whiting to produce a full independent report that would decide the matter. That, of course, would report later in the year. France's other team, La Rousse, were notably absent from the grid again, having hoped to be able to join in at the San Marino Grand Prix. They were now stuck in a chicken and egg situation, whereby Paul Gillitzer of Ford wouldn't supply them engines until they could show him the money, especially as Simtek and Pacific apparently still owed him for the first two races. But Malaysian oil company Petronas wanted to see a car on track before they released their promised $15 million, which couldn't happen because they needed that money to finish the car and pay for the engine. New owner Gerard Mersaudi was in court in Toulon just before the race, arguing for a little more time, but it wasn't looking good. As if to emphasise just how much the teams and drivers at that end of the grid lived from hand to mouth, Roberto Moreno had been able to convince Guido Forti to keep him on, but only if he brought new small personal sponsors to each race. He cheekily asked French journalist Gerard Crombach if he could put him in touch with anyone. Quote, "I'm selling the right and left sides of my helmet, $6,000 each." Over at Pacific, Andrea Montemini had come down with a dose of appendicitis a week before the race, which prompted the usual rush of potential drivers. Alessandro Zanardi let it be known he was available, but Keith Wiggins and Bertrand Gachot instead contacted Paul Belmondo, who not only knew the team, but brought personal sponsors Egol Oil with him. Only Gachot participated on Thursday's practice, but then on Friday morning, Monty showed up with a note from Sid Watkins clearing him to race, having had keyhole surgery allowing him to recover in time. So, metaphorically if not literally throwing his hands up in despair, the actor's son was back out of a drive again, declaring, "F1 is over for me." Nigel Mansell, by contrast, was back. McLaren had designed and fabricated a new tub for him, about 25mm wider than the original, in just 32 days. He'd tested it at Silverstone on April the 20th and was very happy with it, with a slightly smaller steering wheel the last piece of the puzzle, and the bullish Nigel was now talking about wins by the end of the year and a second title in 1996. Quote, "Ron had to wait for me, just like Senna in 1993, he said, apparently unaware of exactly how annoyed his new boss was now by the whole saga. He hadn't wanted Mansell in the first place, and he certainly hadn't wanted to spend millions in valuable development funds building a new car for him. With all that going on behind the scenes, the F1 paddock at least tried to put on a united show of remembrance on the anniversary of the death of Ayrton Senna, which would fall on the day after the race. On Friday evening, a small private ceremony was held at the Tosa Corner, with Roland Ratzenberger's father Rudolf, Nick Worth and Barbara Bailau in attendance, and laid some flowers and an Austrian flag, and lit candles at the site of Roland Ratzenberger's fatal accident. I can't find any record of Gerhard Berger being in attendance, and perhaps PR duties for Ferrari kept him away, but he was surely there in spirit at least. The wall at Tamburello, meanwhile, was adorned with flowers, candles, and painted messages in memory of Senna, and it was one of the main topics of conversation in the media, though the drivers were mostly keeping their thoughts to themselves. Berger, speaking as head of the GPDA, spoke for them all. "None of us will pass through Tamburello without thinking of Ayrton, and I personally haven't forgotten Roland either." Viviane Senna was in attendance too, of course, launching a new collection of Ayrton Senna sunglasses. The judicial inquiry into the events of last year continued too. A deadline for submitting evidence was originally set at the 30th of April 1995, a year after the accidents, but had been postponed by 6 months so that the prosecutors could go to the race meeting and talk to some of the main players. Patrick Head also wanted to access the impounded wreckage so Williams could make a start on their own investigation, while the investigators had heard rumours that on-board camera footage from the No. 2 Williams existed and talked to Bernie Eccleston about that. Both cases were unsuccessful. The track itself looked very different too. Despite rumours that the required works would just not be financially possible, 2 major alterations and a host of minor ones had been made. The most obvious at that fateful Tamburello corner, which now had a left-right chicane at its former apex, with Villeneuve now reprofiled into another 4th gear chicane to slow cars coming into Tosa. The chicane on the drop down into Acqua Minerale had been removed though, and Variante Bassa, where Barrichello had crashed heavily in practice, was straightened out into a single chicane, so the organisers hoped that it would still retain some of its character as a fast demanding circuit, just safer now. All in all, some 60% of the track had been revised. And so out the cars went to have a go at the new track. Jordan had revised their livery to include a bit more Irish green, while Tyrrell had changed to a half-and-half blue and white livery, apparently being mistaken for Ligier's too often in the opening rounds, and André de Courtan's team had apparently bowed to peer pressure and put a raised nose on the Sauber. While there was a new evolution of the Renault engine for Williams and Benetton, and a number of other minor tweaks and developments around the paddock. The grandstands were packed on Friday after Jean Alesi dominated both Thursday free practice sessions. Both he and Berger were given new Ferrari sports cars, a silver-grey 355 Spider for Jean and a red 512 TR for Gerhard, at the event. Perhaps symbolically it was a Simtek, Verstappen's, which was first out on Friday. The rest of the qualifying session was quite open, with provisional pole changing hands a number of times between Alesi, Hill, Coulthard and Schumacher, and in the dying seconds Berger went out and was just 0.008 seconds off Michael's time, which sent the crowd berserk. There was disappointment to come for both Jean and Gerhard though, as first their nice new sports cars were both stolen overnight, Berger apparently nearly being run down by his as he tried to prevent the thief getting away, and then the temperatures climbed throughout Saturday morning, so the track was slower overall, and it was mostly Friday's times that decided the grid, though a few did improve. And so Michael Schumacher had his first pole of the year, with Gerhard Berger alongside. The Williams duo were on row 2, with Coulthard again out-qualifying Hill, despite Damon being one of the few to do better on Saturday. Alesi was disappointed after being top on Thursday to be able to do no better than 5th, but was still half a second better than 6th placed Häkkinen, who'd been 3rd in free practice but struggled to find the right qualifying setup. Irvine, driving at Imola for the first time after missing last year's race through his ban, was 7th ahead of Herbert, 2 seconds off his teammate, and Mansell, who was repeatedly stymied by traffic, and Barrichello 10th a year on from his colossal accident here. Morbidelli continued making good use of the footwork Hart and was 11th, with the Ligiers and Tyrrells continuing their jousting in midfield, interrupted only by Frentzen, and Verstappen impressed once again in the Simtek in 17th, with Inoue apparently getting the hang of his footwork, making fewer mistakes and lining up 19th, between the two Minardis and ahead of the Pacific's, 40's, Sciattarella's Simtek and Wendlinger, who had a big off on Friday. After the heat of Saturday it rained heavily overnight, and by Sunday morning it was still cold, grey and miserable, and the rain returned during the warm-up, conditions which caught a lot of drivers out as they found the new limits of the track. Schumacher spun 4 times, Hill 3 and Coulthard 2, as the two Ferraris topped the timings but were a good 20 seconds slower than in qualifying. By race time the rain had stopped and the track was starting to dry, but was still damp enough for most drivers to decide to go on wet tyres, with Häkkinen, Irvine, Mansell and Morbidelli gambling on starting on slicks. The drivers formed a circle on the grid to hold a minute's silence for Senna and Ratzenberger, then climbed in and got ready to go. The green light shone and they all slithered off the line, with Schumacher holding onto the lead ahead of Berger, Coulthard, Hill and Häkkinen, with Alesi passing the Finn at Villeneuve, while further back in the pack there'd been contact between two of the slick-shod drivers, Mansell and Morbidelli, which had given the luckless Gianni a puncture and dropped Nigel to 14th. Schumacher and Berger fairly sailed away from the Williamses, and Alesi was likewise pulling away from Häkkinen, nearly 7 seconds ahead of him by the end of the first lap. Clearly, wets were the right tyre to start on. The question would be how quickly the track would dry out and make everyone else stop. Morbidelli came in to replace his tyres and decided to stick to the plan and put a new set of slicks on, rejoining last, as Schumacher and Berger continued marching away from the Williamses, the gap from Berger to Coulthard just over 3 seconds at the end of lap 2. Even those with wet tyres were finding it a bit treacherous, with Badoer nudging Suzuki into a spin and Herbert having an off-camera one and dropping from 10th to 14th. Then Badoer was involved again, this time being hit from behind by Wendlinger, who came in for a new nose, while Luca came in for a checkover. All of which meant that suddenly Schumacher was among traffic very early, allowing the Williamses to catch back up, and Badoer was nearly involved in a third incident as he cut Berger up at the last chicane, which wouldn't endear him to the fans at the track either. The Austrian was quickly passed, but Schumacher was starting to pull away, and at the end of lap 6 Berger made the gamble of switching to slicks, rejoining 5th after a bit of a slow stop. Next time round, as Montemini spun moving off the dry line to get out of Schumacher's way, Berger put up the fastest lap, which rather suggested he got the timing right. Herbert executed a beautiful double 360 just in time for his teammate to lap him on lap 8, and then Alesi was in for slicks too, a quicker stop getting him out 5th behind Berger as Barrichello followed him in. It was definitely time to change, as both Berger and Alesi were now lapping in 143s, while Schumacher was doing 148s. Herbert came in to change to slicks and was in the window for a first fuel stop, but Schumacher was on his way in too, so Johnny was hustled out of the pits, leaving just as Schumacher arrived, with Hill also coming in behind him. So now Coulthard led from Berger, then Schumacher and Hill exiting just in front of Alesi. On the outlap, Schumacher's Benetton suddenly snapped right on the way down to Piratella, sending him slithering across the wet grass, rubbing his front wing off on a concrete wall, before the combination of sand trap and tyre barrier stopped him. And with Coulthard now also stopping for slicks, Berger was now leading the race to the delight of the fans. Coulthard rejoined right in front of Alesi, and Jean set fastest lap as he attempted to move up to 3rd before David's tyres could get up to temperature, as the pair of them came to lap Herbert, who'd had to go round a lap and then come back in for fuel. So Berger led Hill by a comfortable 12 seconds or so, with Coulthard and Alesi close together behind him. Wendlinger's miserable weekend continued as he was given a 10-second penalty for speeding in the pit lane, which he came in to serve straight away. Alesi and Coulthard were still going at it meanwhile, trading fastest laps before Bertrand Gachot nearly took the Williams off and Alesi pounced, going into Tozer alongside, but Coulthard held his nerve and the place. They were moving through traffic too, really testing Coulthard's defensive capabilities as Alesi looked this way and that. Verstappen had made his way off-screen up to 12th, but no sooner had Murray Walker commented on the fact, and the fact that the BBC's Steve Ryder had brought some parts over for them in his hand luggage, the Simtech was out with the gearbox failure. Hakkinen made his first stop from 5th, but the crew couldn't get the fuel hose off again, and he was stationary for 15 seconds, dropping him to 11th, just behind Mansell in 10th. Montemini came in for fuel, tripped the speed radar and earned himself a stop-go penalty, then had a gearbox failure anyway on lap 18, so definitely worth him rushing back from his operation. As Alesi put up another fastest lap, with all three of that little group gaining on Berger at about a third distance. On lap 19, Hill set the fastest lap just as he came up to lap Hakkinen after his disastrous stop, but the Finn didn't make any problems for the three as they went past. They soon passed his fellow countryman Sarlo too, as he toured off with a blown Yamaha, and as the track continued to dry it seemed like the Williams was better on dry tyres than the Ferrari was, with Hill closing on Berger and Alesi unable to stay as close to Coulthard. Hill was held up on lap 22 and he lapped Katayama, only to get a bit out of shape and see the Tyrrell retake the place, allowing Coulthard and Alesi to close right up, as Berger came in for a stop, putting Hill into the lead with Coulthard right under his rear wing as they started lap 23. The Ferrari crew did a quick pit stop, but Berger's clutch engaged unexpectedly and he stalled, needing a restart to get him on his way over 30 seconds later and 4th ahead of Irvine. The top three then, Hill, Coulthard and Alesi, were still running as if they were attached by elastic as they passed Eddie Irvine, who was just on his way out of the pits. He'd pulled in for new tyres only to be angrily waved away by the mechanics at the Ligier pit where he'd stopped by mistake. There were definitely too many teams wearing blue at the moment. There was more traffic trouble as Coulthard was cut off by Martini, allowing Alesi to get right back on his case, nearly rear-ending him as they braked for the new Tamburello complex, and Katayama got it all wrong fighting with Irvine, put a wheel on the wet grass and spun to a standstill. Mansell had quietly made his way up to 6th as Alesi made his second stop, which returned him to the track still third with Berger some distance behind in 4th. The Williams twins were lapping close together until on lap 28 Coulthard got it all wrong exiting the Villeneuve chicane, made a great recovery to get it going again, still second, and came in at the end of the lap for new boots and a drink of fuel, and still got out ahead of Alesi. Hill lapped Mansell, giving him a cheery wave as he blew past, and Nigel was in at the end of that lap anyway. Such was the spread by that stage that he was able to retain 6th ahead of Irvine, as Hill arrived on the tail of 5th-placed Barrichello, who was in turn being held up by Badoer. Both got through, but rather than stay behind Rubens, Hill made his second stop a lap before the half-distance mark. A problem-free stop got him back out still in the lead, so halfway through the race, Hill led Coulthard with a lazy on his tail, then Berger, Barrichello in 5th and Mansell 6th. Nigel moved up a place when Barrichello's gearbox locked up, which put Irvine up into the final points place, so swings and roundabouts for Jordan. Coulthard went past Diniz, still running on wets, who then nearly took out Alesi in the final chicane, earning a trademark Jean fistwave, and just then Coulthard was given a penalty too for speeding in the pit lane. He was nearly taken out by Alesi, seeing red as he charged, and Coulthard had to slow for some traffic ahead. Mansell, Panis and Martini all on different laps. Both Minardi drivers were making absolute nuisances of themselves this afternoon, but Coulthard and Alesi both squeezed through, before David peeled in on lap 36 to serve his penalty and rejoined 3rd, still ahead of Berger, who came in for his 3rd and final stop a couple of laps later anyway. No problems this time, and he left the pits still 4th. With not a lot going on at the front, the TV director spent some time watching the trio of Badoer, Wendlinger and Morbidelli in 15th through 17th places, with Suzuki in 11th behind them waiting for a chance to put a lap on them. They all moved up places on successive laps when Schiattarella and Gasho both dropped out ahead of them, and as the Pacific was pushed off, the cameras picked up another trio all on different laps, Alesi, 2nd lapping Mansell, 5th lapping Panis, 10th. Soon enough, at about 2/3 distance, it was time for another round of fuel stops, with Panis and Häkkinen opening the batting, as Hill put in another fastest lap with a 22-second lead over Alesi, who made his stop on lap 43, followed by Mansell, who needed a new nose for some reason, and rejoined just ahead of Irvine. Coulthard also needed a new nose after bouncing across the curbs, and he came in on lap 44 to do that, promoting Berger to 3rd. No sooner had Mansell rejoined the track than Irvine tried to get past at Tosa, the McLaren cut across in front and sent the Jordan's front wing flying while giving Mansell a puncture too. Shades of Häkkinen and Irvine's accident at the start of the Argentine Grand Prix. Both drivers came in for repairs as a marshal sprinted across to pick up the bits of Jordan. And then on lap 46 of 63, Hill came in for his final stop with a huge lead over Alesi, but more problems with the fuel hose saw Hill stationary for nearly 15 seconds. Not enough to lose the lead, but Alesi was now just 16 seconds behind and scented what would be a famous maiden win. He put his foot down and charged. Wendlinger stopped for tyres from 15th and 5 laps adrift, only for the right rear wheel nut to stubbornly refuse to move, and that was his unhappy race done, as Hill sped up and stabilised the gap back to Alesi, while Coulthard was pushing hard to catch Berger, now just 8 seconds ahead with 8 laps to go. Gerhard simply got his foot down a bit and set the fastest lap of the day, which seemed to secure himself 3rd place. So now the entire grandstand was just willing something to happen to Hill's car to give Ferrari a 1-2 win, because that looked like the only way it was going to happen. It nearly did, with 4 laps to go, as Hill once more had trouble with Pierluigi Martini, who nearly made himself the hero of Italy before finally glancing in his mirrors and earning himself a distinctly uncharacteristic Hill fist shake as the leader finally got past. And that was it for drama on track, as Hill ticked off the last 3 laps to take an emphatic win, with Alesi 18 seconds behind in 2nd and Berger 3rd, which the Tifosi evidently decided was a perfectly acceptable result and mobbed the track as usual. Coulthard in 4th was the last man on the lead lap, with Häkkinen and Frentzen taking the remaining points, Herbert in his favourite 7th place and 2 laps down, and Mansell 10th on his return to F1, finishing behind Irvine, recording Jordan's first finish of 1995. Just as in Argentina, the 2 40s were both still running at the end, having made 1 stop each, albeit too far behind to be classified, in this case 7 laps down. Gerhard Berger might feel he could have won without his botched pit stop, but said as far as he was concerned Williams still had 0.5 a lap on Ferrari, which was better than last year, and he was confident they could make that up within a few weeks. Alesi meanwhile took aim at Coulthard, who he blamed for squeezing him out twice. "You're still very young," he ended. Damon for his part was simply effusive about his car, said how important it had been for the team a year on to be successful at Imola, and that it had been a great birthday present for Georgie, his wife, who turned 34 on race day. He finished by saying that he felt more determined than ever to emulate his father. Schumacher was decidedly less chatty, needless to say, saying he'd felt something was wrong with the back of his car as soon as he came out on slicks and that they'd have to look at the telemetry. But as it turned out, the telemetry just confirmed what everyone else had suspected. He'd tried to go too fast too soon, just lost the back coming over the rise. So Hill took the lead of the Drivers' Championship with a lazy now equal on points with Schumacher, while Williams and Ferrari were now equal on points at the top of the constructors' table, as everyone packed up to head to Barcelona for the next race.